I'm Steph Garcia Cichosz with D1 Ticker, and I am delighted to be joined today by Chris Murray, columnist at the Nevada Sportsnet publication, to talk about the open AD chair at Nevada. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, there is a lot to dig into here. This is a juicy athletic director opening, but let's take a second to reflect on outgoing AD Doug Knuth's tenure. He still had time on his contract, which was set to run through 2023. And there was a lot of positive moments during his tenure. Was there any indication for, those in the media, those in the UNR community, that this departure was imminent?
Yeah, I think so. I think the big breaking point kind of publicly was when Jay Norvell left Nevada to go to Colorado State. He became the first Mountain West football active head coach to leave one school for another. And along the way, when he took the Colorado State job, he was very public in terms of what he felt like was a lack of support. Now, that's not all on Doug. It's in terms of the facility improvements, the kind of budget he had to work for, the kind of compensation he was getting as the lowest paid head coach in the Mountain West. But I think that did bring to light that there were some, fissures in terms of the leadership at Nevada, and whether that leadership led by Doug Knuth had the kind of vision and communication to kind of paint a brighter future for what, Jay Norvell was hoping for, and a lot of Wolfpack coaches were hoping for. I mean, during that whole period, I obviously talked to a lot of boosters and people in the know. And, there were even some people who were kind of pushing for Doug to be pushed out in that moment and for somebody else to hire the new head coach. Now, Doug has a very strong track record when hiring coaches, so he was able to hire that next coach, Ken Wilson, who has a lot of ties to Nevada. But I think that was kind of, publicly the first kind of sentiment that was out there, that there were some issues within the Nevada athletic department. Now, privately, there were some issues. Nevada's going through some Title IX compliance issues. Doug did what I thought was a very good job. I mean, he basically came to Nevada as it jumped from the WAC to the Mountain West. There's always going to be revenue issues for Nevada just because the kind of state and university financial support is nowhere near close to the Mountain West average, usually about 10 to 12 million below the Mountain West average, just because Nevada is a no income tax state. So higher education is not funded at a higher level, which means higher education, college athletics is not funded very well. The student base is not as large as like a San Diego State or a San Jose State that gets 10 to 12 million dollars a year in student fees. Nevada's about $2.5 million. So there were always going to be some financial issues, but I think the bigger concern was the right athletic director in place to kind of unify the booster base, the student athletes, the coaches, the fans, and raise the kind of money to get Nevada up to where it needs to be from a facility standpoint. So 9 years in, he had 14 years left on his contract. Nevada's going to owe him about $380,000 in monthly installments all the way through next fiscal year. But I do think at some point, Brian Sandoval kind of had to pull the trigger because it came pretty clear that Doug was no longer the guy to galvanize this community and get all of Wolfpack Nation together. So while he did have a lot of high moments, hiring Eric Musselman was huge. Hiring Jay Johnson in baseball, who's since gone on to Arizona and LSU, was huge. Hiring Jay Norvell when nobody really thought he was a legitimate candidate was huge. So he did some really good things in kind of the marquee men's sports, but there were certainly some issues with the women's sports, which has only won one Mountain West championship in Nevada's decade in the conference.
There's so much to dig into there. And as you mentioned, Nevada President Sandoval is a renowned fan of Wolfpack athletics. So hopefully that means the next AD coming in will have a little bit more support, what President Sandoval can do. So with that, there are a lot of opportunities that await the next AD. There's no major head coaching hires to make. There's some stability there. And as you mentioned, men's sports are doing quite well. So from a competitive standpoint, what are the top 3 priorities for the next athletic director to lead the Wolfpack?
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point that you have a men's basketball coach, Steve Alford, who's locked in for the next 7 years, and then a football coach in Ken Wilson locked in for the next 5 years. So you don't really have to, or even have the ability to make many changes in the revenue sports because of the contracts those two people have. I think goal number 1, the next AD has to improve the facilities at Nevada. Nevada does not have an indoor football practice facility. They're calling it a field house because it would be used by all the sports, the students, the faculty, maybe even people in the community. That's a $25 million project. When Nevada entered the Mountain West in 2012, it was the only cold weather school in the Mountain West without that indoor football practice facility. So still a decade later, they have not been able to get that money. And the students actually did do a $8 million pledge through student fees in 2015 to help pay for that facility. Nevada was unable to get the private donations to make that facility, actually built in a reality. So if it's going to happen again, in the near term, they're going to have to push that through a student vote yet again. So I do agree with you that Brian Sandoval is certainly going to help in terms of athletics, and he wants them to be very successful. He's the former governor at Nevada. He's very popular. He grew up in Reno. He's a huge Wolfpack fan, and I think that's kind of a blessing and a curse. I think if the old president, Mark Johnson, was still in charge of Nevada, Doug probably would not have been, removed from his job, because there wouldn't have been so much of a pulse from the president's office on just what's going on with Wolfpack athletics. I think point number two, it's just getting Nevada Title IX compliant and being able to fund the women's athletics to the level that they deserve to be funded. And that includes facilities as well. I mean, just last month, Nevada softball had its locker room broken into. They had $15,000 to $20,000 worth of equipment stolen. Nevada softball's locker room is literally a shipping container with a couple of windows, and it didn't even have a locking key. And that's why it was able to be broken into. So, that's kind of embarrassing for Nevada to, have a softball facility that was built in 2007, and they don't have working toilets over there. They don't have actual permanent locker rooms. So I think putting more emphasis on the women's sports and making sure they achieve at a higher level is very, very important. And I would say goal number three would be to, get people into the stadiums. Obviously, that's a goal for any AD, but Nevada basketball under Eric Musselman, they were averaging 10 to 11,000 people per home game. Since Coach Alford took over, that number has really fallen. Their season ticket base has fallen a lot. I mean, they were at 7,000 last year, and that's an inflated number. You look at Mackey Stadium that holds 26,000. That average attendance is usually around 14, 15,000. So can you light everybody up in the community to go out there and really support the Wolfpack? And I think Doug did that at the beginning of his tenure. But when you're a decade in, sometimes, things get a little bit stale and you just need a new voice. So I think that's what Nevada will be looking for in its next AD.
Well, you've mentioned several of the biggest challenges facing the Wolfpack right now, but there's a few others I want to throw at you and get your take on. Obviously, Nevada has had budget deficits of at least $500,000 over the past few years, and COVID certainly didn't help. What is the culture of fundraising with the Wolfpack supporters, fans? What does that look like?
I mean, I think it can be good. There aren't a ton of major businesses in town. Tesla moved into town not too long ago, but I don't think they really care too much about Wolfpack athletics. There are some pretty affluent areas in the Reno area. You think of places like Montreux, which used to host a PGA Tour event, or Arrow Creek. You go up to Lake Tahoe and think about Incline. Now, a lot of those people, are not necessarily born and raised Wolfpack fans. They're people who come from out of state. They try and take advantages of the tax system here. So being able to cultivate that group and getting them behind Nevada is huge. I'm sure we'll talk about NIL, but you look at Nevada men's basketball, they've been able to cultivate about $200,000 in NIL, pocket money to kind of spread out throughout the team. So I think if you do a good job of making those connections, the money is there. Steve Alford, maybe he hasn't had the win-loss record that Nevada wants, but him and his associate head coach, Craig Neal, did recently raise $8 million for new players' locker rooms, both for men and women, and a players' lounge. It will be a 2-story building next to their practice facility. So I think that is proof that the money is out there, and it will be very interesting to see if this next AD can get that field house project done. That's about a $25 million project. The proposed funding model would be about a third private donations, a third of university money, and then a third of student fees. I think if Nevada can go out there and get that project done, it will show a seriousness about athletics that I think people in this community question whether Nevada has. And clearly Jay Norvell questions whether Nevada had that. He would not have left in conference for a Colorado State team that his team beat 52-7 in the regular season finale if he thought Nevada was serious about being a championship level athletic department. And that's where Brian Sandoval wants to take this department. So as he remakes Nevada athletics, I think you are going to see a renewed interest or push to get a lot of those capital campaigns. Now, Nevada's been doing that this year because it's 10 years in the Mountain West, and they kind of did build a model around that. But one of the big issues is Nevada was doing a lot of cool projects, $5 million in football improvements, this basketball players lounge I just mentioned. They're going to be doing things over at the softball field, giving locker room space to like the swimming and diving team. None of these things were being communicated to anybody, really. You look at how Boise State went out there. They put out like a 50-page kind of document on all of the changes that they're going to be doing and facility improvements they're going to be doing. over the next several seasons as they try and push to get into the Big 12. And they really marketed that campaign really well. Nevada's doing some cool things, but they're not telling anybody about it. They're not getting the community excited about that. So I think the messaging and communication of where they're trying to take this program needs to be much better than what it's been the last couple of years.
Well, for starters, we should probably tweet at Elon Musk to see what he wants to do if he has a connection with Tesla in town. You mentioned NIL. Tell us the landscape right now for Wolfpack student athletes regarding NIL and what this AD can do to, be more of an advocate in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a huge part of college athletics moving forward, whether you like it or not. Like the reality is, unless you're paying players salaries through NIL, you're not going to be able to retain your best players if they go out there and they're spectacular. You look at Carson Strong, Nevada quarterback, who recently signed with the Philadelphia Eagles. I mean, this was a guy who, if he would have come back for his senior season, probably could have went on the open market and made $300,000-$400,000. He was that good of a player, a two-time Mountain West Offensive Player of the Year. So how is Nevada going to battle to keep those guys? I think in men's basketball, they've done a pretty good job. They'll probably use a third party to help their NIL deals. You look at kind of this first year of NIL, Nevada was not, I would say, proactive about, kind of being the first out there to try and get this stuff done. I do think there's a limited amount of money in the area to be able to get that. So it'll be interesting to see how Ken Wilson, the football program, try and raise money, as Steve Alford's already kind of tapped that market to a degree. But, I think Nevada men's basketball is very serious about, taking that under its wing. In terms of the next athletic director, there are a couple of candidates out there, Garrett Classy from Nebraska, potentially, who's, done a really good job in terms of NIL with Nebraska. I know he was in the mix for the UNLV job and they ended up keeping their interim coach. But I think if you're an AD and you're going to Brian Sandoval, you do have to paint that vision of, this is what I'm going to do with NIL. This is how I'm going to keep us competitive. Yeah, maybe we can't compete with Power 5 schools like Miami and give guys $400,000 a year in a car, but can we be in the top 3 or 4 in the Mountain West? You have San Diego State and UNLV in huge markets with a lot of businesses that are going to help. You have New Mexico basketball in specific, who just loves that sport, and they're going to get a lot of help from their boosters. But you need to be in at least the top half of the Mountain West in NIL. Nevada's not in the top half of the Mountain West in most budget things, but I do think that they can be there in NIL if they really do, hire the right AD and then rally the right people in the community, specifically in men's basketball, because I think there's a passion for that, given the Eric Musselman years and how good Nevada was, a consistent top 25 team, 4 Mountain West titles in 4 years, 3 NCAA tournament berths, a Sweet 16. They peaked at number 5 in the nation. I do think that if you can galvanize the fan base and the boosters in that sport specifically, you can have a lot of success, especially with a coach like Steve Alford, who's been doing this for so long.
Well, the last point of contention under Doug Knuth's tenure that I wanted to bring up was staff turnover and department morale. What is the status of that, and how can an incoming AD come and right the ship?
I mean, it's hard just because the salaries Nevada offers is not commensurate with a lot of schools in the Mountain West. You're not ever really going to be able to say we're going to pay you top 3 value if you come be an SID or a compliance officer or in our academic center, a senior associate AD. None of those things are you really going to be able to pay at the top of the Mountain West. So then I think it comes down to showing appreciation for your workers. How do you keep those people on board and retained, even if you can't offer them the highest salary? And I think the only way you do that is with great leadership, with great communication, with great vision, with great respect for what they do. Nevada is currently working with 2 full-time SIDs. You look at a Boise State or a UNLV, they've got 5 SIDs each. So how are you supposed to communicate and market yourself and talk about all these great things that you're doing and really build a link between your fans and your players, so the fans go out there and they're celebrating the athlete for more than just what they do on the field? If, just using SID as an example, you're not fully staffed there and you have SIDs doing 7 or 8 sports, just running around and, with their heads cut off because they're being asked to do so much. So, I think that's where leadership steps up. I mean, all of us certainly want to be paid what we think we're worth, but we might be willing to, get a little bit less than that if we know that our bosses appreciate us, if they're giving us a chance to be successful and they really do care about us as people, which is not easy to do when you're talking about an athletic department with, a couple hundred people. But I do think, in terms of the staff morale, it certainly has not been great. There were layoffs during the pandemic, which certainly didn't help. And those were tough decisions that had to be made. But I just think in general, You got Steve Alford out there. He doesn't have a secretary. He doesn't have a marketing person. He has to do a lot of things beyond what your average head coach would do just from the day-to-day operations. And that probably takes away a little bit in terms of what he's able to do as a coach in recruiting and X's and O's and building relationship with his players, because his attention is being diverted to things and jobs that, your average Mountain West school would already have filled.
Well, given all of these challenges and opportunities, what type of administrative background will fit the Wolfpack's current needs, but also its long-term culture?
Yeah, I think this is a really good job. I know we've talked a lot about some of the negative stuff, but the cool thing about the University of Nevada is it's really the big fish in town. There are not pro sports here. There's a AAA baseball team, and that's it. That's your competition, AAA baseball, and then high schools. You think of UNLV, for example. They used to be the toast of town. Everybody used to care about Rebels basketball, but now they're fighting with the Raiders. They're fighting with the Knights. They're potentially fighting with an NBA team in the future. You think about San Diego State. They're sharing time with the Padres. I mean, Reno Sparks has about 450,000 people, and they are tuned in to Nevada. This is the pro sports team in town. They get a ton of coverage from the local media. So I think that is a huge positive, is that you are, the sport that everybody focuses on, and they want you to be great. And they're not, looking at this other sports team. You go to San Jose State, they probably wouldn't rank in the top 10 of teams in town, with the Giants and the Warriors and the 49ers and Cal and Stanford. So I think that's a great opportunity. I think you need a fresh vision with whoever this AD is going to be. I kind of likened it in a story that Doug Knuth was kind of the Wolfpack's parent in its toddler years in the Mountain West. I think he did a good job of helping build it up over the last 9 years. But now, Nevada's trying to take that next step kind of into being a college student or a high school student in terms of now being championship great. Nevada's won 10 Mountain West championships in its 10 years in the Mountain West. Can it get up to that level of San Diego State, which has won about 35 during that same time period? That's going to be the big question for this next AD. Do they have the vision to be able to make great out of what is a bottom three budget in the Mountain West year in and year out? And that budget, it may improve a little bit with Brian Sandoval, but it's never going to be in the top 4 or 5 of the Mountain West. It's never going to be in the top half of the conference. So you're going to need somebody in that AD seat who's very smart, who knows how to, turn a small budget into a lot of success, who's not going to make excuses for what you don't have, and will, try and focus and leverage the positives, which include a great city. I mean, I know Reno doesn't have the greatest reputation because of Reno 911, but I've grown up in northern Nevada the last 30 years, and I think when people actually do come into this town, they're kind of blown away by how great Reno and Tahoe are, how great this campus is. I've probably been to more than 50 college campuses covering sports over the last 20 years. Nevada ranks right up there with almost any campus that you'll see. It really is a beautiful campus. They've put literally over $500 million into the campus over the last 15 years. Now, not enough has gone to athletics if you ask Wolfpack fans and Wolfpack coaches, but it's certainly a great area. If Nevada gets student athletes onto their campus, they typically get that commitment because people are really awed at just what this campus looks like.
Well, let's talk logistics. I want to know about time frame for this search. The last search lasted about 9 months. We're kind of expecting this to be faster. Do you have any inkling of which search firm Nevada might be using? And then salary potential. We know that the average in the Mountain West is 400 to 450,000 a year. What's your take on those 3 issues?
Yeah, I think time frame is going to be certainly quicker than the last AD search. At that point, Carrie Groth, who actually works on campus now in the business school, she kind of announced she was retiring a year before that retirement happened. I think you look at the timing of this, ultimately, you probably want a new AD in place within 2 to 3 months. If you get it within 2 months, then you're looking at that new AD being in place day 1 of the 2023 fiscal year. So it kind of gives them a fresh start for the next athletic season, which will begin July 1. The interim AD is Bill Johnson. He's actually the VP of advancement for the university. He has an athletics background, but he wasn't working in athletics. He was actually a former basketball player at Nebraska. He was on their coaching staff when Nevada played Nebraska in the 1997 NIT, and he's worked with a number of different conferences within athletics. I'm actually speaking to him in 2 days, so I don't know if he's interested in the full-time job, but I did get confirmed by the university that they will be using a search firm. The last time they did that was 2013. They used Collegiate Sports Associates run by Todd Turner to not only hire Doug Knuth, but also the football coach who was hired a couple months before Doug Knuth was hired. That was Brian Polian, the son of Bill Polian, the NFL Hall of Fame executive. So I would say you'll probably see a new AD in place within the next 3 months. And I would guess the salary would be competitive in the Mountain West. Doug Knuth was making $400,000 a year. 50,000 of that was donated by boosters annually, 350,000 in terms of Wolfpack funds. So my guess is you look at a 5-year deal, probably around $400,000 to $450,000 a year. You look at what UNLV paid their AD, it was roughly commensurate with that. And Nevada and UNLV usually like to be pretty aligned there. So I would say, somewhere around a $2 million deal over 5 years would make some sense. And, Brian Sandoval, like I said, very, very, he's just passionate about the university to start with. It's very rare, I think, that you get a president who's also an alum of the school. This is a guy who really cares about the University of Nevada, and I think that trickles down all the way to Wolfpack athletics. And let's be honest about it. Presidents at colleges, especially in the FBS, their tenures are a lot dictated, and how fans look at them are a lot dictated by how the sports do. Should that be the way that things are kind of done? Probably not. But Mark Johnson, his predecessor, was a very good president for the university, but he didn't really, love sports. And I think people kind of were rubbed the wrong way to a degree just because of that kind of lack of love for sports. So I think Brian Sandoval understands that if Nevada Wolfpack athletics is good, his popularity, which is already huge because he was a very beloved governor for 2 terms, will be even higher in terms of people in the Northern Nevada community.
Well, you mentioned one maybe potential candidate in Bill Johnson, who is serving as interim AD, but you've thrown out a few other names. We have the UMBC AD, Brian Barrio. We have Nebraska Associate AD, which you've mentioned, Garrett Classy, and then former Miami Athletic Director Blake James. Let's talk through those potential candidates and if they really are fit for the role. And is there anyone else that's on your radar?
Yeah, I think I pick out Brian Barrio just because he's had, a term with the Wolfpack from 2015 to 2018. He was the sport administrator for football, men's golf, and volleyball. But it's certainly his work with the football team. You want an AD who knows football because that is, whether you like it or not, the most important sport on campus because it drives the most revenue. And if you have success there, all that money trickles down to the rest of the athletic department. He left Nevada to go be the AD at Central Connecticut State University. And then from there, he went to UMBC. So now he's had 2 different stints as an AD. He's worked at, some really good schools like Pepperdine and USC. He worked in the American East Conference as well. So I think his familiarity with Nevada and kind of some of the shortcomings and how to try and overcome those are important. And then he has that AD experience. I think whoever the next AD is, I think they need to have AD experience. You talk with coaches on campus, and that's one of their really big things. They need to have done this before because there are a lot of things at Nevada that need to be cleaned up. And it's not really a job where you need to learn on the job. If that's the case, then they're not going to have a ton of success right out of the gates. You look at Garrett Classy, I think just the fact that he was a finalist for the UNLV job, he would have to be interested in Nevada as well. It offers, a position within the same conference. It offers an opportunity to go against UNLV. Nevada and UNLV, the only 2 Division I athletic departments in the state. They have an annual Silver State Series all sport competition. So they're huge long-term rivals. And I think he may want to prove that, you should have hired me at UNLV if he is able to come to Nevada. He does have AD experience at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He was the interim AD at Nebraska as well. He had some experience at Oregon, so he's got some West Coast ties. And then in terms of Blake James, I think if you look at him, he's been an AD at Miami and Maine. Obviously, things at Miami at the end didn't work out well just because they wanted to put a little bit more money toward football and really build that thing up. But I think you look at him as kind of an all-sport athletic director. He did a good job at Miami. So those are 3 that, pop into my mind. I think it's still kind of too early in the process to fully know, who Nevada's honing in on, but I would be surprised if those 3 weren't names that were at least seriously considered as it's whittled down to a finalist category.
Well, as we wrap up here, Chris, I want to throw these stats out here. Our partner site, Athletic Director U, has teamed up with Athlete Viewpoint to do rankings of different conferences. They call it the Athletic Department Power Index. For the Mountain West, when in terms of department in general, but also AD potential, Nevada has ranked, towards the back of the pack. What, in your mind, is the growth potential for the Wolfpack brand among the Mountain West, but also among the Group of Five?
Well, I mean, the challenges financially are always going to be there, but I think the cool thing about Nevada is that you do have the opportunity to, I think, be one of the better athletic departments in the Mountain West. I do think the fan support of this being the big fish in town is huge. I do think that there's enough money in here to potentially go out there and have a lot of success in terms of the fundraising. And I think it will give you an opportunity to elevate Nevada to, from, I would say, probably like the 8th or 9th best athletic department in town, or in the Mountain West, up to the top tier. And I think one of the good things is you look at the revenue sports. I mean, men's basketball has been to 7 NCAA tournaments since 2004. They've reached 2 Sweet 16s. They've had 3 different head coaches go into the Power 5 level, and Eric Musselman, Trent Johnson, and Mark Fox. You look at football since 2014. They've made, I have to count them up because there's a lot, 16 bowl games. So this is a team that is almost always in a bowl. You look at baseball, they've won 3 Mountain West championships since 2015. So the sports that really matter in terms of churning revenue and really getting connectivity, Nevada's had success there. And I think that's a very positive thing as well. Like, you're going to be judged to a degree on how your revenue sports do. So I think the opportunity, the proof is in the pudding that can actually happen. It is interesting that there's never been an AD in Nevada that has gone up to a Power 5 level. They have not had a lot of ADs recently, just in terms of their history. Basically, your average AD has spent almost 15 years on the job. You go back to 1954 when Jake Lawler, who the basketball arena is named after, they've only had 5 ADs since then. It went from him to Dick Trachok to Chris Alt to Kerry Groth to Doug Knuth. All of those people had at least 9-year tenures. So I think there's going to be some job security in terms of, the history of Nevada is you're going to get a long time to do this job. So would it be, a top 2 or 3 job in the Mountain West? I wouldn't say that, but I would also say the Mountain West is probably the 7th best conference at the Division I level. So it's not quite the American Athletic Conference in terms of how much money they put into their sports and the kind of stadiums that they have, but it's a nice jump up if you are at a UMBC like Brian Barrio. So I think there are certainly pros to the job. There are cons to every job, and there are cons to this job. But I do think there's an opportunity to have success in the big sports, and B, it's really cool to live in Reno. I mean, people who live here, and even talking with Doug Knuth after he was fired, that was one of the things that he kind of expressed, is just how much he loved living here and loved this community. And I don't think that was, that was kind of like just between me and him kind of conversation. So I do think that is a huge selling point, that this is a really cool place to live. And if you kind of like a mid-sized city that's not too big, that's, really nice to raise a family in, Reno should rank pretty high on your list.
Well, there are so many opportunities awaiting the next athletic director for the Wolfpack. Chris Murray, columnist at Nevada Sportsnet, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your infinite wisdom about Nevada athletics. We are very excited to follow along with this search and with your reporting covering it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.